Uh, Hello, everyone. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for being here this one today or this evening. It's just past midnight here in Beijing. So this talk is on mistakes in improvisation and in general on the value, the supposed value of imperfection in improvised musical performance. So the question is pretty much this one. So we could start with a plausible normative claim. So mistakes, flaws, imperfections, mishaps, and so on are not as bad in improvised musical performance as they are in work performance. Why is that? Well, an obvious motivation is that there are difficulties in spontaneous musical creation, which is what improvisation is supposed to be, that justify a more lenient attitude towards the performer. It's more difficult, so you're not as harsh. So this is fairly straightforward and uncontroversial. But a more controversial view is that we should go further and claim that mistakes and imperfections are part of what makes improvisation interesting and valuable. So not just something that should be tolerated, but in some sense, something that should be positively valued and cherished. So the question simply is, how does that happen? How do mistakes and imperfections contribute to the value of improvised performance if they do? So the plan is first to examine two, I think, useful preliminary distinction between product and process values and formal and genetic imperfections. I think these are distinctions that you find one way or another in several contributions to this debate. And to the debate in general on improvisation. And then a good chunk of the talk is going to be devoted to the discussion of what I think are two important views on this issue. So perhaps the most famous and the one that sort of originated the debate is Hamilton's aesthetics of imperfection. And then I'm going to discuss a bit, a few thoughts expressed by Alessandro Bertinetto in an interesting recent paper on improvisational mistakes. Then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to introduce this distinction between first and second order mistakes. And this distinction involves the way the performer's intentions are realized or not in improvised musical performance. And then I'll try to explain why I think it's useful, why it matters, why it can help us make some kind of progress in understanding the alleged value of mistakes in improvised performance. So let's start from these two fairly basic distinction of product versus process values. In a recent very interesting discussion of improvisation, Andrew Kania, in his introductory textbook on the philosophy of music, distinguishes between product values and process values. So quite simply, product values are, as it were, formal kind of ascriptions of value. So they are elements of a performance that can be evaluated independently of how the performance came to be. So again, formal praiseworthy features. They're in improvised performance, in fact, they are often the same features that would contribute to the value of composed works. So unity, coherence, originality, and so on. On the other hand, we have process values, and these are those values that we can only attribute to a performance once we know something about the way the performance came to be. So is it the rehearsed performance of a score work? Is it something that is more like an impromptu creation, so a spontaneous musical creation? So obviously we are interested in this when we are also interested in process values when we talk about improvisation. So it seems to be a requirement to improvisation that very little about it or is previously planned, and of course this figures in the way we evaluate what is going on in an improvised performance. So, a way to capture the distinction would be to say that product values focus on performance in the sense of a sound event without asking what it comes from, and process value focus on the performance as an action. And a related distinction is the one between formal versus genetic imperfection, sort of the negative side of the distinction. So formal imperfections are flaws in performance that do not depend on any knowledge as to how the performance came to be. So again, things that say are out of style and that somehow throw the off balance the composition, the musical line and so musical structure and so on. Whereas genetic imperfections can only be attributed to a performance once we know something about the performance as an action. So of course, flaws that involve something going wrong with the performer's intentions would be of this sort. So if you want a parallel from a different, domain, a non-performative and non-musical domain, well, yeah, non-performative domain, think of fake vintage versus an actual vintage or road-worn kind of effect on an instrument, so you could think of fake vintage as an imperfection, but that's a kind of imperfection that you can attribute only once you know how it came about. That it was not the product of actual wear and tear over the years, but it was actually just artificially concocted, it replicated in a factory or in some other way. So I start from Andy Hamilton. I think an effective way to capture what Hamilton is complaining about in this interesting series of articles on the aesthetics of imperfection. You could say that Hamilton is complaining against a Bob Ross view, a Bob Ross attitude to improvisational mistakes. So Bob Ross is this famous TV personality who was teaching lay people how to paint. He's enjoying some renewed popularity thanks to YouTube, and he's famous for this kind of positive attitude, optimistic attitude. And he would say, there are no mistakes, just happy accidents. So you put a brush stroke where it wasn't supposed to be. That's fine, no problem, no panic. Just turn it into a little bush, a little rock, a little whatever. No mistakes, just happy accidents. Now, this view is pretty much the sort of still in line with what I presented at the beginning, that sort of the straightforward, uncontroversial attitude to mistakes in improvisation. So you forgive the beginner painter for these mistakes when they're painting alla prima in the style that Bob Ross was teaching, because, well, they are beginners, and you forgive and don't pay much attention to the improviser's mistakes because, well, they're not beginners, but they're trying to produce complicated musical structures on the fly. So you take a lenient view, you tolerate mistakes and so on. But as I said, Hamilton wants to claim something more radical than this, namely that mistakes are not just to be tolerated, but to be cherished and valued. So the Bob Ross attitude is what you find in Ted Gioia's book, The Imperfect Art. That's an explicit critical target in Hamilton's work. But Hamilton wants to take things one step further. So what's this? What's Hamilton's view? Again, it's expressed in a whole series of articles, and not claiming that what I'm going to say here is an exhaustive presentation. But I think that there are two central claims that are somehow related, plus an additional one that is also very important. It's clear that he considers it very important, but I also think it can be separated from the other two. So we can discuss the first two without getting into the details and possible problems of the third. So what's the two central claims, the ones that I'm going to focus in the first part of this talk? The first is that in improvisation, imperfections are not just tolerated, but they are actually a source of value. So this is the anti-Ted Gioia view, the anti-Bob Ross attitude. So, so this is an example of Hamilton expressing this view in a recent article. I quote, "I now argue against Gioia that imperfection is not a means to an end, but contributes to the value of the whole. Thus, the Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi involves object-specific appreciation, acceptance, aging. A mark on a bowl enhances its value." So you're going to see this analogy with wabi-sabi and how it's supposed to be informative or helpful in understanding aesthetics of imperfection, and why I think it's not necessarily helpful to understand the musical case. That's the first claim. The second claim, an aesthetics of imperfection involves a positive attitude towards contingencies in the creative process, and in fact strives for such contingencies. So we're going to unpack the two claims and also examine later the way Hamilton seems to relate these two claims. So at least at one point, it looks like Hamilton is claiming that the first claim regarding the value of imperfections follows from the second one, or at any rate, they somehow go together. Now, the additional claim, very briefly, as I said, this is not an object of discussion in this talk. And Hamilton's claim is that an aesthetics of imperfection should extend to all musical performance. So I quote, "The aesthetics of imperfection embraces improvisation and composition. It is an aesthetics of performance." So composition here is, Hamilton means performance of compositions. So work performance and improvisation, they are both, they both fall under this aesthetics of imperfection. Now, of course, this is not a descriptive claim. So Hamilton realizes that the way he's characterizing aesthetics of imperfection, there would be a lot of work performers who don't follow that. So it's a normative claim. It's the idea that performance should strive for unpredictable personal interpretations, as opposed to striving for monolithic, pre-planned, sort of airtight, interpretation that they repeat at each individual performance. Very interesting idea and so on, but not what we're going to discuss today. And again, I think you can accept the two central claims and think those shed some light on improvisation without accepting the additional third claim. Let's look at the first claim, imperfections is valuable. And again, Hamilton discusses the case of wabi-sabi as an example of aesthetics of imperfection. Now, as far as I understand, it's particularly the sabi part that relates to imperfection, and particularly sabi aesthetics is takes a positive attitude to certain features that objects have in virtue of their the aging process that they have gone through. So there are some asymmetries with the musical case. And an obvious asymmetry, it seems to me, is that imperfections are not the central focus of appreciation in the case of musical improvisation, regardless of what you want to say. Even though you may want to say that they are in some way, of some aesthetic interest, whereas in the wabi-sabi case, they seem to be the focus of appreciation. They're simply nothing else that you focus on. They are just, they are the main thing. It looks in musical performance, it looks like not only imperfections are not the central focus of appreciation, but insofar as we value them, we seem somehow to relate them to what is more successful in performance. I think Bertinetto, for instance, gives a good account of this, and we'll see that later. So this is an example of this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia article on Japanese aesthetics. So this temple, this Japanese temple that was in the 80s covered with gold leaf, according to the original plan. So it acquired a rather flashy and stunning appearance, but of course it doesn't have this kind of aged appearance, this kind of patina that gold leaf would only acquire with decades, if not centuries, of exposure to the weather and so on. So old-time residents of Kyoto famously complained that it would take a long time for the building to acquire sufficient sabi to be worth looking at again. So if wabi-sabi is supposed to be an exemplary case of an aesthetics of imperfection, it looks like there are some central asymmetries with the musical, improvisational case that we should bridge. So here we have a case in which imperfections are the central focus of appreciation, and also we have a plausible story regarding the reason why imperfections are valued. So the plausible story is that the imperfections are related to the history of the object, and somehow to the fact that imperfections show the fact that an object has a relatively long history and somehow bears the traces of the passage of time. So we need, I think, a more specific defense of the idea that imperfections are valuable. So imperfections contribute to the value of the whole, but how exactly? What's the value of the whole, and how do imperfections contribute to it? So perhaps it's helpful to look at the second claim. In fact, the part that gets the closest to a definition of an aesthetics of imperfection, rather something that Hamilton explicitly presents as a definition of the aesthetics of imperfection. And it really contains two parts, and the second is supposed to be an improvement or further specification of the first. And the first formulation is that the aesthetics of imperfection is an open, spontaneous response to contingencies of performance or production that aims to create something positive from apparently unpromising as well as promising circumstances. Now, this Hamilton thinks in this recent contribution is quite explicit. He thinks it's not enough, and I think he's right to say that it's not enough, because I think that this is the Bob Ross view. An open, spontaneous response to contingencies of performance or production that aims to create something positive from apparently unpromising as well as promising circumstances. That's Bob Ross. So he adds this part regarding striving. So imperfectionism is a constant striving for new contingencies to respond to. So I think that this idea is not necessarily new. So I call this claim improvisation as problem finding. The expression is not Hamilton's. It's by Keith Sawyer, who also wrote on improvisation, and writes that improvisation is characterized by an emphasis on creative processes that are problem finding rather than problem solving. So you don't just you don't just react positively to unpromising circumstances. In some sense, you look for them. You try to get into trouble. And then I think you have another thought that goes in the same direction by Libby Brown that I think I consider the writer with maybe the most interesting things on improvisation from say philosophical standpoint. And he has this idea that we can conceive of what the improviser does as something like a simultaneous commitment to two regulative ideals, he calls them. The first is that the improviser tries to create formally interesting musical structures and that's so spontaneously. I realize I forgot to write this part, but spontaneous. Oh yeah, I wrote it. Yeah, spontaneous creation of formally interesting musical structures. Sorry. And the second regulative idea is that the improviser takes risks in the creation of such structures, so that these spontaneously created musical structures are somehow daring. They don't go down well explored usual paths, but rather take new avenues and so on. So once you commit to these simultaneously commit to these two ideals, then you are really in this situation of in this kind of problem finding mode, right? So Libby Brown expresses this by saying that the improviser finds himself in a sort of high risk environment. Now Hamilton describes imperfectionism as a constant striving, and I think there is an analogy that isn't just linguistic with this idea of striving play developed by T. Nguyen. So, for instance, take this description of playing a game of racquetball. So Nguyen is describing how he would play this game with his spouse, and he could take classes. Either of them could take classes in order to improve their abilities. but the goal is struggling, is not winning when you play a game in that particular way. So I quote, "I manipulate my capacity to win with an eye toward maintaining a desirable sort of struggle. But during the game itself, I play all out to win. If my decision to forego those lessons, so the racquetball lessons, is comprehensible, then striving play is a real motivational possibilities." So something that can happen in games is that you don't take win as the ultimate goal, but you focus on the struggling, right? So that's I think a sensible view that what happens in improvisation has a lot to do with this idea of focusing on the struggle. But there's still a problem in trying to justify the value of imperfections in this way. So it seems to me that it's not clear that claim one, so claim one was in improvisation, imperfections are valuable, not just tolerated, follows from claim two. So the imperfection is a constant striving for contingencies. This is the quote where I think this kind of entailment claim is most clearly presented. But yeah, I want to read it. So does claim one from claim two? So there's one way in which we can justify the entailment claim, and you can think of like mistakes and imperfections as those contingencies, that we strive for, and then the claim holds. I mean, we strive for contingencies, and mistakes are contingencies. So mistakes are valuable because they are the ultimate goal of what we are doing. But this is doubtful. I mean, it's doubtful that we strive for mistakes when we play music. It's doubtful that we strive for mistake when we play games. If you look at what's going on here in the striving play scenario, during the game itself, you play all out to win. You like the struggle, but it's not like you go and look for mistakes. So suppose you exclude mistakes from the contingencies that you respond to, and perhaps you look for other contingencies that you need to respond to. So no non-mistake contingencies. So for instance, some unexpected things that happen in your musical environment. So for instance, some daring moves by the people you're playing with, and so on. So if we restrict contingencies in this manner, then I think, well, we could be satisfied by so if we restrict contingencies in this manner, it seems to me we would still prefer mistakes to be as low and as let's say unserious and as possible, right? So this is I think an interesting way of fleshing out this claim by Andrew Kania. So surely an improvisation that did not include errors of form or execution, that sounded finished or complete, even though it was a genuine improvisation, would be more valuable than one with an improvised feel due to just such errors. So what's going on here, and the passage is clear when you read it in context. I didn't want to read the whole thing, but what's going on here is that Kanya is comparing two cases, one that is a genuine improvisation, so spontaneous and all the rest, unplanned and so on, but and it does not include errors of form or execution, so no mistakes, no imperfections, and another one that is spontaneous and all that, but includes errors of some sort. One way or another includes errors. So yeah, surely it's true that errors can somehow contribute to what's valuable in improvisation, or they can somehow be guaranteed that what's going on is an improvisation, but other things being equal, we prefer an improvised performance that doesn't have mistakes, that is spontaneous, creative, and all that, but in which mistakes are as low as the amount of mistakes is as low as possible. So I think that this, Kanya's principle is mistakes and as expressed here is mistakes and imperfections are pro tanto bad, and I think you can hold on to this even if you accept that there is a striving element in improvisation or risk-taking element in improvisation. So I move on to the second author, Alessandro Bertinetto. So this is a chapter he published in 2016. And again, the topic is mistakes, more specifically on improvisational mistakes. Really. So it starts from a definition of mistake as a deviation from requirements, norms, and expectations. And it's an intentional feature of Bertinetto's view that that these requirements, norms, and expectations are like ambiguous between, let's say, stylistic requirements, so things that work across performances. So like, you know, gypsy jazz as norms, expectations, in the sense that all of the performers would work in that kind of, you know, musical style, in sort of abide by those norms and you know, stylistic conventions and so on. But he also uses norms, expectations, and in general normativity to express what's going on in the formed. So what does it mean that the normativity of performance has been transformed? Let's look at an example. I think it's easier. So Herbie Hancock on Improvising with Miles Davis recollects the following: the music was, I quote, "the music was building, the audience was right there with us, and at the peak of Miles' solo on So What, I played a really wrong chord. Miles took a breath and played a phrase that made my chord right. Miles didn't hear it as wrong, but instead as something that happened." So this is an example of a resolved mistake. So what's going on here is that the normativity, again, at the performance level, so the expectations and norms and so on that were valid in the particular performance, have sort of evolved in such a way that looking retrospectively at the mistake, at Herbie Hancock's mistake, you know, it wouldn't feel wrong anymore. So it would be it would comply with that kind of transformed normativity, as Bertinetto calls it. Now there's a further claim here that Bertinetto makes, and that's that a mistake is a mistake only if it is not successfully resolved. So if it goes through this normative transformation that allows for the mistake to be resolved, then it's no longer a mistake. Now the denial is motivated, it seems to me, by the definition of mistake that Bertinetto gives. So if mistakes are context-relevant deviations from a normative framework, the resolution of the mistake implies that the mistake is no longer a mistake because the normative framework has changed. So it's not an arbitrary denial, right, that the mistake is no longer a mistake. But of course, it's also puzzling for a few reasons. I mean, it's kind of not in line with the way we talk about mistakes in other contexts. I mean, surely we've made mistakes in our lives, and sometimes they turned out that, you know, we sort of turn them to our advantage, or, you know, exploit them in one way or another, and we'll learn something from them and so on. But we don't stop calling them mistakes, and they were mistakes. Now maybe this is not a very powerful consideration. Maybe aesthetic normativity, you know, has its own rules, and you know, or maybe it's just a quirky use of language, and we're really talking about different things when we talk about mistakes in these different contexts. But another reason is that in some sense it's precisely because they are actually these are actually mistakes. So that the Herbie Hancock case, that the process of resolving them is particularly interesting, and the skill involved is valuable. So it's the unintentional nature of the mistake that guarantees the spontaneity of the response. And that's more evident. That's even more evident when instead of having two performers responding to each other, you have an individual performance who does something by mistake, and then has to somehow, you know, respond to it and somehow, you know, fix the situation. But I think we have a solution, so we can have it both ways in a way. So you could say that resolved mistakes are not imperfections in the formal sense. So you can have you have a plausible, you know, norm, plausible aesthetic normativity, as Bertinetto calls it, according to which the mistake, once it's been resolved, is no longer a mistake, because formally speaking, it makes sense. Okay, it's legitimate according to some kind of style or normativity internal to the performance. But they are imperfection in the genetic sense. At some point, somebody played something that they did not intend to play. So they are imperfections in the genetic sense because of how the material that was produced, that was played, related to the intentions of the performer who played it. So this idea of performance intentions as a way of clarifying or describing what's going on with the improvisational mistakes, this idea is what animates the latter part of the talk. And really the sort of inspiration for this is a famous paper by Randall Dipert on the composer's intention. So very different debate on musical performance, so work performance. And Dipert observes that when we talk about respecting the composer's intentions, actually it could mean several different things. So composers could be described as having low-level intentions, and so these are related to performance means. So play this pattern, this fingering on this particular instrument, and so on. Then they have middle-level intentions, so they might aim at producing certain auditory experiences. And of course, you could change low-level intentions and achieve similar middle-level intentions. So Diper's example is you could have a super synthesizer that exactly reproduces the timbre, the exact timbre of an instrument. So you would have the same auditory experience, but you wouldn't be respecting the low-level intentions of the composer. And then you have high-level intentions, the sort of the noblest of intentions, as in a way, as Dipert calls them, which are Dipert calls them the effects that the composer intends to achieve. He mentions perception of tone and relationships, and he mentions expressive effects as examples. Well, one of Dipert's points is that of course, respecting low-level and middle-level intentions may not bring about the intended high-level intentions. So his example, most famous example of this is suppose that it's conceivable that someone like Gluck would use the clarinet, which was an instrument that was new at the time, to startle an audience when a new musical line, a new melody was introduced. Because why? Because it was introduced by a state in an unfamiliar timbre, right? So Dipert says, if today we perform a work of Gluck's with the originally scored clarinet, we are preserving his low-level intentions, but are sacrificing his high-level one. So how does this apply? So why is this relevant to improvisation mistakes? Well, we can draw a more general lesson from this, which is when we create when we specify musical material for appreciation, whether in composing or in performing. So when a composer or performer creates a musical structure, that in some sense there are at least two things that they may intend to achieve. And here I'm sort of conflating together low and middle level and separating them from high level. So first, the composer or performer wants to specify a particular musical structure, so a chord, a note, a phrase, or an arpeggio, and so on. And second, they intend the structure to achieve a particular musical goal. I list them here. I'm gonna give some example in the following slide. Now, of course, it's possible. No, this doesn't work like that all the time, right? Sometimes we just play around, we just doodle, and we don't have any kind of goal. We aimlessly play notes and stuff, or maybe we practice, we just play scales to improve technique, and we don't have a particular musical goal in mind. We don't, there's nowhere where you're trying to take the music, but very often it's not like that. So when your music teacher tells you you cannot just play your stock repertoire of licks and phrases, you need to tell a story. What they mean is that you need to have some kind of musical goal for your solo or for your whatever thing that you're playing. And this, of course, works for composition as it works for improvised performance. So the suggestion here is that we distinguish between first and second order mistakes. So there's two different ways of being mistaken when performing. So first order mistakes occur when the performance intends to play musical structure S, but then fails to play S. So you want to play that diminished chord, and you screw it up. You mute the strings, and it just doesn't come out. Or you want to play an A chord, but your hand is in the wrong place, and you play B flat or something like that. Second order mistakes occur when the performance intends to achieve a musical goal by means of a certain musical structure, and the performer successfully plays the structure but does not achieve that goal. So the structure is unable to achieve that goal, at least in that particular musical context. So you want to give sort of renewed energy to a solo, and you decide to play this kind of arpeggiated figuration, and you think it's just gonna do the job, and then you realize that, well, for whatever reason, it just doesn't do that, and it still sounds kind of dead. It just locks into the structure of the solo, and it doesn't really bring up much renewed energy. So take, for instance, possible kinds of musical goals. You could have expressive goals, so you want to take music in a certain direction, expressively speaking. So you could make mistakes in this sense. You could play a chord and thinking that it's going to turn a relative subdued musical line into a more positive one, but it's just not going to do it. You could have functional goals, so you could open up things harmonically, or try to bring them back home, and so on. And of course, you could be mistaken, and also you could be disoriented harmonically, and so you could be mistaken as to the contribution of what you're going to play. You could have stylistic goals. So one thing that you often think of when you improvise, I think, is whether you're playing something that sounds in style, or something that sounds somewhat alien, somewhat exotic in the style you're playing in. And I think one thing that happens, at least the thing that happens to me, is that sometimes you don't really have a clue. Like you think that this thing is going to sound in style, but it doesn't. You think another thing is going to sound somewhat quirky, but actually fits in. So these are stylistic goals that you could have. You could have dynamic goals. So this is kind of self-explanatory. And if you have, maybe I thought you could have these perlocutionary goals, in the sense of I had particularly in mind how some writers on the topic, and I think Bertinetto has a paper on this, stress how in jazz performance the relation to the audience is crucial. So you could think of musicians doing things in order to interact with the audience, to get some kind of response from the audience. And of course, you could think of this as a possible musical goal. So in all of these ways, you can go wrong in the second order sense of the term. So as perhaps it could recall the distinction developed by Austin between accidents and mistakes. I think there's no precise overlap here. So Austin's distinction is that suppose I go out at night, I want to I develop a dislike for my donkey and decide to shoot it, and so I go out and try to shoot it, but I shoot your donkey by mistake or by accident. What's the distinction? Well, suppose that I go out and I don't bother to check, and I just shoot the first donkey-like thing that I see, the shape that I see in the dark. Then I've shot your donkey by mistake, because I had procedures. There are procedures in place to determine which donkey you're shooting at, and I have not employed those procedures. But then suppose that I actually go through those procedures, and then my donkey moves unexpectedly, or drops dead unexpectedly, and then I shoot your donkey because it's right behind. Then I've shot your donkey by accident. Okay, so the distinction is supposed to make, I mean, there's quite a bit of discussion, I think, about this distinction, but I think there's a general agreement that the distinction is supposed to make sense of different levels of responsibility. So, for instance, you can say it was my mistake, but you cannot say, sorry, it was my accident. Now, the distinction does not precisely overlap I think, with first and second order mistakes. So you could think of first order mistakes as a subset of accidents and second order mistakes as a subset of mistakes in the Austin sense. But I don't think that that's correct. So I think first order mistakes are only sometimes accidents. Sometimes it's not your fault. Other times maybe it's your fault. And in many other occasions, I guess it's very hard to determine. So if you got drunk before your performance, maybe it's a mistake. And second order mistakes, I suppose they almost always are mistakes in Austin sense, but I maybe you can think of cases in which they are accidents. Like you could think of cases in which the musical environment around you changes because the other people that you don't have control over, they just do their thing, and they're allowed to, and so you don't realize the goal that you intended with that particular musical structure. But anyways, so hoping that the distinction is clear and meaningful, I wanted to spend the last few minutes talking about why I think it can be interesting to discuss the alleged value of mistakes, or why mistakes can be interesting. So first of all, this is first and second order mistakes. They're not something that exists only in improvisation. Of course, they can exist in work performance as well, but there are salient differences. It seems to me in work performance, of course, that's the most obvious salient difference. That in work performance, second order mistakes threaten the broader performance goal of achieving the work's goal as established by the composer. This could be a more kind of local goal of a particular section or phrase, or it could be a more general, sort of global goal of the piece. And the thicker the work, one could say, the thicker the work, the more limited the space for the pursuit of additional goals. Okay. And the second relevant difference is the second order mistakes tend to be more interesting in improvisation because we are more concerned with the impromptu aesthetic choices of the performer. Again, I'm not claiming that we are never concerned with impromptu aesthetic choices of the performer in work performance. I mean, certainly in a way we often are, but rather I think it's reasonable to say, and I think several authors would agree, that there's a focus on the activity of the performer in jazz improvisation that we don't have in other musical practice or musical traditions. So interesting versus uninteresting mistakes. So don't be afraid of being wrong, be afraid of being uninteresting. This is something that from a manual on improvisation that Hamilton quotes in one of his articles. So it's an interesting notion that some mistakes may be interesting and others may not be interesting. And I think the distinction between first order and second order mistakes may somewhat help in this sense. So first order mistakes are rarely really interesting. More precisely, it seems to me they could be formally interesting. So maybe sometimes you play something by mistake in the first order sense that just sounds fine or even good in that particular musical context. So you could listen to it and think this is just a good musical line. It would do, it wouldn't disfigure a carefully planned composition, for instance. I mean, it's a rarity, but it could happen, right? But they are rarely, I think, first order mistakes are rarely genetically interesting. They don't shed light on what's going on in the performer's head. They don't shed light on the performer's aesthetic choices. So there's nothing in them there's literally nothing in them that the performer intended to do, right? Of course, one can accept this claim, and this doesn't deny that first order mistakes may also be incorporated into interesting musical structures. So this is a resolved mistake in Bertinetto's sense. In fact, if you go back to the Herbie Hancock and Miles Davis case, you could think of this as a first order mistake that gets resolved. So that can happen to first order mistakes as it happens to second order mistakes. Now, it seems to me that from the passage, it's hard to start to say what kind of mistake this is. So what does it mean that the chord was really wrong? It's not clear whether it was wrong in a first order or second order sense. Excuse me. Okay, first order mistakes may also be incorporated into interesting musical structures. Now, I've claimed that first order mistakes are rarely genetically interesting, so they don't shed light on the performance aesthetic choices. Of course, they could be genetically interesting for other reasons, right? I mean, they could tell you something about, how they came to be, that is of some kind of interest. I just think it's not an interest that is very central to the evaluation of improvised performance. I mean, they could be indicative of subpar technique. You could think that like first order mistakes, tell you something about that particular performer's alternate picking technique, or if there's a guitarist or something like that. But this seems to be of secondary interest. I mean, we are mainly concerned with aesthetic choices and musical choices as opposed to technical accomplishment. And finally, I wanted to note here that this claim that Bertinetto makes of mistakes in general, that they reveal aspects of aesthetic normativity. So they reveal aspects of aesthetic normativity because, well, mistakes are by definition a deviation from that normativity, by Bertinetto's definition. It seems to me that this is only true of second order mistakes. It doesn't seem to me that first order mistakes reveal anything about aesthetic normativity. I mean, they reveal that you should, that if you intend to play something, then you should play it. But that's a very general point about aesthetic normativity. So the individual first order mistakes don't reveal anything further about aesthetic normativity. So another claim, if you recall, that Bertinetto makes is that mistakes that are unresolved are real mistakes, and those that get to be resolved are no longer mistakes. So I wanted to talk a bit about unresolved mistakes here. By the way, I think the framework here that I developed in terms of musical goals can provide an alternative description of mistake resolution, so that how a mistake gets to be resolved. So a mistake is resolved when it contributes to the realization of a subsequent musical goal. So you can use this conception of musical goal to provide a description of mistake resolution. So it seems to me that second order mistakes are interesting also when left unresolved. So the whole of Bertinetto's discussion focuses on resolved mistakes, and I agree that that there's something interesting in the idea of resolving mistakes. The process of resolving mistakes involves skills that are central to what an improviser is supposed to be able to do. But I think second order mistakes are interesting also when they are left unresolved. So they show an improviser's musical and performative limitation, which they show what the extent of an improviser's understanding of the musical language that he or she is employing. And of course, at some basic level, these mistakes are not particularly interesting when say you are a beginner. So they may be interesting to you as a beginner because they teach you something about well, your own limitations, but they may be relatively uninteresting to people who are interested in the musical language as let's say as practiced by those who actually master it. But of course, it's not just beginners who make second order mistakes. It's everybody. If they're pushing themselves in jazz performance, so if they're striving, if they are taking risks in Levy Brown's sense, they would be making second order mistakes too. So Nguyen has this concept of stupid games. So they are the games that are fun if you try. They're only fun if you try to win, but the fun part is when you fail, when something goes wrong, when you make mistakes. So the example is, say, a game like Twister, or the game like the telephone game, where like you whisper something at somebody else's ear, and then the message gets back to the first person in the circle, and it's completely distorted. So you need to try to win. You don't need to, intentionally. You cannot intentionally make mistakes, otherwise the game loses its purpose. But there's something peculiarly interesting and well, not really interesting, but fun in failing. So I might suggest that improvisation can work like a stupid game in this technical sense. Not really. I don't think it's a stupid game, neither in the technical sense nor in the more commonplace sense of the term. But I think you could conceive of a variety of conceptions of improvisation, so along a certain kind of spectrum, because improvisation is not a musical genre. Sorry, can you see the screen? I got a message. Okay. Improvisation is not a musical genre, but a kind of musical activity. So it's pointless to think that, it's mistaken to think that there is a normative framework that is valid across the board across all of the contexts that we call improvisation. So what I think you could say is that in some contexts, it's reasonable to think that the primary goal of improvisation is that of presenting the audience with a performance that has a high level of musical unity and musical purpose. So a performance that achieves certain musical goals in a kind of very clear manner. So in this case, you would take risks, you wouldn't make mistakes, but you would have an overarching wish to keep mistakes at the minimum, because mistakes threaten that kind of musical unity. They threaten your achievement of musical goals. But this, of course, need not be the case. So again, you can have several normative frameworks that that are worthy of being called improvisations, because improvisation is just a broad term for a kind of musical activity. So you can conceive of a context in which the improvisers are primarily interested in testing their creative limits, testing their understanding of the language they are employing, and of course, in a way, expanding on it and finding new possibilities. In this case, there would be a higher tolerance for mistakes, and perhaps you could even say a performance that avoided them entirely, that somehow, in which you didn't manage to get enough into trouble as to not commit mistakes, then you would think of that performance that it is deficient. So you have this spectrum of cases from a more like goal-directed kind of improvisation to a sort of striving-directed improvisation. But I think you also have a constraint here. A constraint that will not push improvisations too far along the risk taking or the mistake prone side of the spectrum. And the constraint is that too many mistakes threaten musical unity. So you could think of musical unity as the pursuit of more or less localized musical goals, right? So producing a phrase that is expressive of this, or producing a chord progression that takes the piece tonally in this direction, and so on. So mistakes threaten musical unity. And the more musical unity is threatened, the easier it becomes to improvise, the harder it becomes to make mistakes. So because if goals are absent, or they're not as well defined, because the musical structure is broken down as a result of too many mistakes, then you are getting closer and closer to a kind of anything goes scenario. Now you never get exactly there. You would still be improvising a certain style and so on, but you would have a much easier life than the case in which you have fairly complex musical goals within a certain stylistic environment, and then you'd really be in sort of a high risk environment, because there's a lot that could go wrong. If the musical structure breaks down because there's too many mistakes, then it becomes easier to do something that somehow fits. So I think there's an interesting constraint that sort of would keep improvisation, let's say, in the conservative side of this risk-taking spectrum. And with this, I think I've finished, and I hope I won't fall asleep during the Q&A, and I hope I have not made you fall asleep during the talk. And thank you for being here and listening.
Okay, thank you, Matteo, for this inspiring, interesting talk. I'm sure there are a lot of questions, so you can raise your hands in the chat. I will call you in order. Okay, Jerry, go ahead. Jerry, can you hear me? I think, Jerry, you should unmute yourself. Sorry. Okay.
Now am I unmuted?
Yes. Now, yes, we can.
I think this is a first for me. I don't think I've ever been the first to ask a question at a talk. My policy is always to hang back, but it seemed like others, I expected Julian to jump right ahead. But in any case, what I want to ask about is what I thought would have been addressed more in the beginning of the talk, though I saw it was addressed later, namely what counts as a mistake in improvising. Particularly, my reference would be to jazz improvising, and more specifically to jazz vocal improvising, which I have some experience with. And one thing that I'm not sure is covered even under the second order mistake distinction made later, is that if you were to say improvise, do it jazz improvisation on a standard, and do it exactly as it is written in either the really original score or even the standard chart, that would be a mistake. And it seems like that's just a mistake for that entire activity or that entire genre. It's not a contingent goal you might have. It's just plainly a mistake. Right. So does that count? Is that a kind of second order mistake? If you were not to change anything in the score as written or the chart as given in most real books?
No, I think so. I think not. I think not by definition, and I definitely think that there are further categories of kinds of things that can go wrong in a performance, and that are the fault of the performer. And so I thought maybe you could call them poor choices or just bad, and this would be, I think this would be one of them. Like, if suppose that like I'm kind of freely improvising like Keith Jarrett style and just sit at the piano and just start, playing the C chord or repeat it over and over again. Like, okay, I'm formulating the intention of, creating a happy mood by playing the C chord. So I'm being successful in the first and second order sense, but I'm failing at producing an improvisation, right? So why? Well, presumably, if you think of like norms of improvisation in the sense suggested by Brown, then probably I'm not doing it right in that sense, right? I'm not creating interesting structures, let alone taking risks. So I think definitely there are things you can do wrong that don't fall into the. So it's not an exhaustive categorization. Taxonomy.
Well, what I thought was distinctive about this guy, and I'm talking about improvisation on a standard, not the Keith Jarrett type.
Right. I mean.
What's odd is that if you did what I was just describing, you would be doing something that, in some sense, contained no mistakes, was not a mistake. But in a broader and more important sense, it would have been a mistake throughout. So it's it's just an unusual kind of case, in that, in one sense, there are no mistakes whatsoever. You played it just as it was written by Cole Porter or whoever. But it is a mistake because it's supposed to be an improvisation on a standard, not simply a performance of that standard as a score.
Right. I mean, I suppose you could question that that's you could question that that's an improvisational mistake, because you could question that that's an improvisation at all at that point. I mean, but definitely no. I'm, as I said, I don't have a problem calling it a mistake, and I don't think that what I've offered here is in any case a sort of exhaustive classic categorization of what can go wrong in a performance and what's worth calling mistake in an improvised performance. Yeah.
Can I talk about another example, another question? I was thinking about a standard I once worked on with my jazz mentor. It's called Beautiful Love. I could sing it or I could play it on my flauto dolce, but I think I won't. The point is that there's a certain point in the melody where you came along, where my chart here has it as an, if it's in D minor, the chart has the vocal line as an F there. But my jazz mentor always told me I should sing E, because E goes with the background E minor 9th or 11th chord that's so crucial to what the keyboard people think is essential to the song. But what I argued with him is that if I always sang the E to reinforce the E minor 9th, that's in the harmony part of the chart, that would be a mistake. Let's say you'd want to occasionally sing the harmonically less adventurous F because you had sung the E so many times. Now, I don't know if that was enough, or I'll actually have to play it so you know what I'm talking about.
Right. Okay.
What kind of a mistake, or maybe this is what this comment, it's not a real question, it's more a comment. Like, there's going to be a lot of subjective disagreement among improvisers about what counts as a mistake in that case. Is it singing the note that is harmonically more adventurous and reinforces the adventurous part of the harmony, or is it maybe singing more obvious note, even if it's less adventurous, because you're not always doing the same thing when that same turn of phrase comes along? And if you do a standard chorus, it might be 3 places in which you could be singing that note, either E or F.
No, right. I think it's interesting. For that matter, I think that those authors who appeal to risk taking, they don't necessarily say a lot about what risk taking is, and it's possible that there are several things that fall under that heading. I think you have suggested two possibilities, it seems to me, like doing things that are harmonically more sort of advanced or complex, and in another sense it's just doing something that is not as commonly done, or something that contravenes such an expectation. So it seems to me that these are 2 ways of like taking risks, and which one would be mistaken or less ideal might depend on just what who is performing. I mean, if you are the one who has always performed, it never plays the F, then maybe the risk-taking avenue then would be to play the F, and so perhaps some balance.
The risk-taking involved in playing the F, singing the F in my case, instead of the E, and getting your jazz mentor annoyed.
Right. I mean,
there's that risk. The risk in practice, risks in apprenticeship. There are all kinds of risks. Okay, let me end the comment. But thanks for a very interesting talk with many useful distinctions.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, now Julian.
Hi, Matteo. Could you not share your screen anymore so I can see everybody?
Oh, sorry.
I feel like I'm shouting into the void. Oh, good. No, sorry. I see you nice and big. Thanks. This is, I guess, kind of a follow-up to what Jerry asked about what would count as a mistake. I've got kind of an observation, or a feeling that mere deviation from a requirement, norm, or expectation that wouldn't have to count as a mistake, right? I mean, otherwise, because sometimes what musicians do is they deliberately, as it were, break apart a bunch of norms or expectations or felt requirements from the inside. And that's how innovative music gets to be made. I'm thinking, take someone like Ornette Coleman in 1960. He's like deliberately railing against certain expectations or norms or requirements, deliberately going against them to make something new. And it seems to me that's kind of important. So there has to be something about what the musician wants to do. So yeah, that was my first observation. The second one was, I was kind of waiting for you to come back to what seemed to be Andy's key message, which was that mistakes could be valuable, could be a source of value in improvisation. And I just wonder, that strikes me as being it's kind of Andy overreaching himself, right? And I wonder what you thought of that. I got some hints. I mean, my sense is that, you know, the value of improvised music depends upon the high risk,
right?
You know, that one might make mistakes, or there might even be accidents, but that mistakes or accidents themselves are not a source of value. It's the enterprise being risky that gives you the source, you know, that's the source of value, you know, that makes the achievement of the musician very valuable, rather like, you know, the way in which we appreciate a trapeze artist, someone like that.
Right.
So first of all, you know, what makes a mistake? And second, can mistakes actually be a source of value rather than the possibility of a mistake being a source of value?
Right. So on the first point, like I don't really endorse this definition that Bertinetto provides of mistakes, this kind of general definition of mistakes as deviations. I think he needs it to make this claim that mistakes are no longer mistakes once they're resolved, because once you embrace that definition, then, you know, things to follow. But I agree with you that deviations from norms sometimes are intentional and they work fine and so on. So again, even though I don't develop this kind of exhaustive taxonomy of mistakes in improvisation, the part of the taxonomy that I do develop is focused on performance intentions, because I think that's like a crucial place where you want to look at when you're looking for a characterization of mistakes. Typically, it's something that goes wrong, that, you know, in what the performer does. But then again, it doesn't seem an exhaustive characterization, because then I mean, and that's, you know, this is what Jerry was suggesting. The stuff that you do intentionally that works just as you thought it would, but that contravenes certain norms in a way that isn't interesting, and so you want to call it a mistake. Now, how does that happen? I don't know. Perhaps because what's going on there is that you are doing something. Again, you're realizing you're achieving what you intended to do. You're not explicitly contravening certain norms, but maybe there are higher level principles that you are not respecting. So if you think of like the standard case in which you don't improvise, well, that would seem like a pretty clear case. So there is an overarching norm that you should do something with the standard, with the tune of the standard, not just play it. So then it seems like, okay, you have this kind of, you know, higher level norm, and even though what you're doing musically is fine, so it doesn't contravene, you know, the rules in that particular style, there is still this overarching norm that you are not respecting. But you could have other cases. So if you think the case of the that I mentioned in reply to Jared, so suppose like I'm in the kind of case Jared kind of free improvisation, I just sit down and play a C chord over and over, and like, okay, I have this intention of playing the C chord, and my musical goal is to produce a happy mood, and, you know, I'm successful at that. But it looks like there's an overarching goal that I'm not respecting, and the overarching goal is that I should aim, you know, to put it in Brown's terms, I should aim at creating interesting musical structures on the spot and take some risks. So
in that case, I wouldn't describe what's happened there as a mistake having been made at all. It's just a production of boring music.
I mean, yeah, I called it a poor choice. I mean, a poor aesthetic choice. So yeah. Sorry, the second part of the question. Second question. Look, so I mean, I think it's useful to think in terms of, like, you know, Kanya's pro tanto principle. You know, does it hold? Are there cases in which, you know, things that we want to call improvisation in which the pro tanto principle doesn't hold. And I'm not sure that there are. I think you can think of like these extreme cases in which you're really interested in like pushing yourself, and in which you really wouldn't say that you have done what you were supposed to do if there's no mistake in what you've made. You know, at the end, if you get to the end of the performance and there's nothing that has gone seriously wrong, then it's not really what
exactly.
you wanted.
I mean, it seems to me that a key point of the enterprise is that there will be mistakes, because what you're doing is kind of producing music in the moment. But that doesn't follow from that the mistakes make the music better.
Right,
and
right.
That's where I think Andy's overreached himself.
Right. I mean, I tend to agree with that view. I mean, I sort of try to build the talk in like, I mean, the centerpiece of the talk is that the first order, second order distinction. And I try to build it in a way that is sort of sympathetic to the aesthetics of imperfection kind of view. And then I sort of stay kind of agnostic and at the end, but I mean, I tend to agree with the skepticism about that. That mistakes overall, you know, just like you would expect from the term, are things that we don't want.
But yeah, thanks very much, and yeah, lovely talk. Very much enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think there are none other. Okay, or no other questions. So Matteo, I want to ask you this. I was thinking the aesthetics of imperfection. Do you think that we can really apply to this aesthetics to Western classical music? Because you said that improvisation is not a musical genre, but a musical activity. And also in Western classical music, we have a sort of improvisation, but creativity has to be in balance with the normativity score. And we cannot really transform that normativity. So I think this aesthetics of imperfection is problematic for this genre, because I think we tend to reach an aesthetics of perfection. So
no, it's an interesting question, and really it concerns that, you know, when I said there are two central claims to Hamilton's aesthetic of imperfection, and this is the third claim that I'm not going to discuss. Basically, you're talking about that third claim that I think is very interesting, and that's this idea that Hamilton has of you know, extending aesthetics of imperfection to the whole of musical performance. Hamilton doesn't really say where this idea. To be honest, it doesn't really say a lot in defense of the idea, which is pretty, you know, like normatively speaking, is a pretty big claim, right? Because you're basically saying that that people like Glenn Gould, they're kind of doing it wrong, right? Because he was a perfectionist, right? He was somebody who liked the idea of you know, creating the most possible, you know, perfect possible you know, performance of a certain work, and would not like a kind of aesthetic of imperfection in work performance. So it's a pretty heavy normative assumption. And again, it's a normative claim, it's not a descriptive claim, because a descriptive claim is obviously false. Performers don't all embrace this kind of aesthetic imperfection in work performance. Now, Hamilton doesn't say so much regarding where it comes from. I think it comes from, I suspect it comes from Adorno. Adorno, for instance, you know, disliked many things, but one of the things that he disliked was, one of the people he disliked was Toscanini. And if you read what he has to say about Toscanini, he disliked the fact that Toscanini's interpretations were mechanical, he thought, and sort of animated by this sort of interpretive you know, monism. You know, so every performance had to be the same, was like mechanical, perfect, like machine-like. So these are the things that Adorno complains like about Toscanini. So you could think of like this kind of complaint as the imperfectionists complain against Toscanini, because what he complains really is that there is no room for error, there is no room for spontaneous creation. There's, everything is pre-planned, pre-packaged, and then executed. So again, it's pretty heavy normative assumption that you should never be a perfectionist in work performance, because you're going against all of these, highly recognized performance. I think it comes from Adorno, and I agree with you that it's potentially problematic. So when I talked about first and second order mistakes in performance versus improvisation, I said, in some sense, it's kind of hard to think of how frequently you could have a chance to make those second order mistakes in performance. Typically, were it only for the technical requirements of the performance of most works in the Western canon, you would have practiced these things over and over. You wouldn't be making those mistakes, because especially if the work is in Stephen Dace's sense is a thick work, then you have a lot of stuff that is already determined, so you have little room for your own personal contribution. That means you also have little room for things to go wrong in the second order sense. So I agree with you that the idea is problematic in the sense of an application to work performance. I think, sorry, one last thing. I think there's also so it seems to me that when Hamilton is defending the claim, he's sort of criticizing the idea of interpretive monism and the idea that you should strive for a certain ultimate interpretation of a work, as opposed to finding a new interpretation at each and every time. And yet I think you can have this, you can achieve this goal without embracing an imperfectionist aesthetic. There's no it's still possible to perform a work in 100 different ways without without the differences in interpretation being the product of spontaneous decisions at the time of performance. You can actually sit down and find 100 different ways of performing a certain piece. So here you have the planning, the perfectionist planning, and the interpretive pluralism. So you can have it both ways. If what bothers you is interpretive monism, you don't need to go on stage and whatever, be unprepared. Maybe you still need to go on stage unprepared for some, because maybe there's some kind of argument to that effect, but I'm not completely convinced. So I think I agree with some of your considerations.
Okay, thank you. I think there is a question from Lisa.
Yeah, thank you, Matteo. It was really interesting. So I very much agree with your distinction between first and second order mistakes. And I was thinking about, a parallel with criminal law. So in criminal law, you have a malice, which is dolo in Italian, which is an infraction of a rule that you do intentionally. So that would be maybe something like second order mistake, because you are convinced that you're doing the right things and it's not. It turns out not to be the right thing. And then you have fault, which is generally divided in negligence, carelessness, and inexperience. So it's almost the same, but it's not completely the same, right? I mean, it's malpractice. It's either you don't know what you're doing or you're not experienced enough to do that, and so on. And that would be what you may call a first order mistake, in that it's something that it's not intentional. It depends on you not having the right amount of knowledge or, technical experience and so on. Then you also have another interesting category that we maybe can use in this case. It's like the preterintentional mistake. You are doing something and you don't expect that the result will be as it will be, like when you will hit somebody and then you commit a murder, but you were not intending to do that, right? So I don't know if this may be useful to give like a more specific, way of categorizing mistakes.
No, it's very interesting, and I think maybe to an extent there's more like an overlap between these categories and the accident mistake distinction in Austin's sense. There was a distinction between what's culpable because there's some stuff you could have done to avoid it, and what's actually not up to you. I mean, it's not due to something that was under your voluntary control. So that was the accident mistake distinction in Austin. But it could be some of the categories that you've mentioned, they track. So that it could be that first and second order mistake in the musical case are sort of special cases or a subset of those categories that you've mentioned. I should look into. Unfortunately, I'm not very, not very good at. I'm not very familiar with this legal terminology. I should look into this.
But that's interesting. I mean, the idea is that
that's very interesting. No.
You have the same result, which is bad. Let's say it's something
right.
An infraction of a rule, but then you have to distinguish between, so you have an object which is the same, the result, and then you have a subjective point of view, and either it's intentional or it's not, and then it, the kind of consideration that you make based on these completely change in the case of criminal rule. So maybe it's I don't know. It's my I have to think about this, but this is what I was reflecting on while hearing this distinction.
Yeah. It's very useful.
There is another question from Irida.
Hi, yes. So I'm kind of new here. I'm coming from the direction of philosophy of mathematics seen as textuality and performance in a way. So my question is going to be just, can you see a way to apply what you're talking about to other disciplines, in particular mathematics? So let me just elaborate a little bit more. Usually mathematics is used to talk about music, to somehow analyze music and so on. So I'm kind of trying to go the other way and see whether music theory and aesthetic theory in music can be used to say something about the performance in mathematics. In particular, the equivalent to composing in mathematics is the proof that you have, that you perhaps will try to explain to a friend or try to explain in front of a class. In that case, you have learned something. If you deviate too much from it, it will actually be epistemically wrong. So you have a very clear, up to a point, idea of what is wrong, what is a mistake, and what is not. But you also have a lot of room for improvisation. And in fact, if you deliver exactly what's on the page in a kind of didactically boring way, well, most people will get nothing. They'll be like, oh, I could have read that in the proof. Like, why are you doing this? However, there is a way you can deliver what's on the page and still make it interesting because you are performing. So you are giving it an expressive movement, which the text itself cannot, just by you reading it, cannot give you. But there's also room for further improvisation where you don't necessarily remember exactly how it goes, or you remember, but at the spur of the moment, you have this, okay, but maybe I can try it this, maybe this is a little bit better, maybe this is aesthetically more pleasing, maybe it fits the mood better. So you even go to the point where you're reacting to the mood of the audience, to the context, to your surroundings, to how you feel, and so on. So I think there is room to kind of transfer over an aesthetics of improvisation. Now, whether you can talk about, mistakes in the kind of language that you have told us about today, I don't know, because I haven't thought about it. I have Andy Hamilton's text here, but I haven't yet read it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. I heard the legal question, and legal questions come with mathematical questions as well. So yeah, it's in the same spirit, perhaps.
It's very interesting. I wish I could say something more. Yeah, it's something interesting in reply. I'm not at all sure that I can. It looks like there is there are ways to apply the distinction more broadly, because after all, this is just a structure of like intentional actions that sometimes you want to do something by doing something else, right? Or you intend to do this to bring about a certain result, and that's not just something that happens in music. It just happens all the time in any kind of human action. So yeah, there is. I suppose there is some room to extend this to other areas. I'm not exactly sure that would work in mathematics because, I'm not very familiar with the kind of process of illustration of proof that you are discussing. I suppose it's similar to what goes on in the classroom in other cases, right? I mean, when you teach, you sort of improvise more, more or less. You don't prepare so much in advance, or rather you have an idea what you want to say, and then you react on the spot to what's going on around you and the sort of feedback that you get and so on.
So just to say that when you do have complex proof at university or PhD level, you actually have to learn the proof beforehand. You cannot come and improvise.
Right,
so
right.
It really is close to the score. You have to stay close to the score. You cannot just randomly start talking about something. So there is a parallel, a pretty strong parallel with your intention, with your playing the C chord and so on. I mean, you have to kind of stay with the score if you want to set up the expectation, or if the expectation is set up that you will be playing within that style, in that direction, with a certain goal. Right.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting. I wish I could say something more interesting in reply, but I'm afraid I cannot.
That's all right. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. That was yeah. I'll try to use something and then kind of think about it myself. Thank you. That was inspiring.
Thank you, Rita.
I think there are no other questions.
I just want to say that Alessandro Bertinetto wrote me. He had to go. You followed almost all your talk. That we'll write you some questions because he told me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so you will receive his.
Thank you, Alessandro.
Okay, so we are coming to the conclusion of this session. Before saying goodbye, I'd like to remind you that the next seminar is on the 29th of April with Anne Happelvist, hopefully my pronunciation is correct, I don't know, from the University of Finland, who will be talking about Anslick on the purposefulness of musical form. And the link is the same as today. Okay, thank you, Matteo.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Thank you, all of you.
Bye.
Bye.